Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on MSM, Men Who Have Sex with Men, methamphetamines, and HIV. My name is Mary McCarty and Arias, and I will be your trainer for today. So let's everybody open up your chat. If you go to the top of your slides, you can open it up, and as we go along to some of the beginning stuff, if people want to write in who you are and where you are, we welcome you. So this is the title. Let's talk about what we're going to do today for the next 2 hours. So just so you know, some of you know, we've got Brooklyn in the house. Welcome. Some of you know that I've been working on what's called the stimulant package with the National ATTC, the Addiction Technology and Transfer Center. And what we did was we came up with new curriculum around methamphetamine use and HIV. And what I was asked to do, and you can see that actually on the slide. The title is Stimulants and Their Impact on Brain and Behavior, Best Practices and Approaches for Effective Treatment and Recovery. It was developed in 2020. Yes, welcome everybody. So we have people from New York and we have people from Colorado. Good. So I don't know if you're eating breakfast or whatever, but we're glad that people are here. So what are we doing today? I was asked to work on a special program that is a supplement to the stimulants and their impact on brain and behavior. And it's called Methamphetamine Use and HIV Among Men Who Have Sex with Men. I wrote this with Holly Ireland and Jay Yarborough, who are at another ATTC at the Dania Institute. And so what I've done for today is combine that information with some basics about stimulants. Okay, so ready to go? Just as some of you have seen, we have this in all of our courses, and that the training was supported by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And the important thing is that the contents are solely the responsibility of the Northeast and Caribbean Addiction Technology and Transfer Center. So just some of the history, some of you may have seen this before, but the ATTCs, the Addiction Technology and Transfer Network, was established about 18 years ago, and there are 10 sites in the United States. And the one that I work for, the Northeastern and Caribbean, we cover all of New York, all of New Jersey, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. I think the cool thing about having webinars is we've been able to have people from all over the country and all over the world. So I'm not sure how you got into this course. Maybe you're on our website, or maybe you're on our mailing list, but there's just a variety of courses. There's probably 5 other courses that are offering today. One of the reasons I wanted to offer this course was because I wanted to make sure that we could give Oasis hours, and some of you know what that means, and that'll be on the slide. But anyway, there's a lot of stuff that can be helpful to you. Now, this is the map. I don't know if you could see that. The key, by the way, is that those blue pieces, those are the Addiction Technology and Transfer Center. And you can see that, as I said, there's 10 of them. We're number 2, where it says, you could see the blue New York and New Jersey. And I don't know if you could see Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands there. I think it's also important for people to know, if you don't already know, is that there's something called the PTTC, the Prevention Technology and Transfer Center. And we work with one of them, the one that is at Rutgers, and we do trainings for them as well. So if you're interested in prevention, they are really helpful and a wealth of information. And in addition, there's also the mental health. So they focus on a lot of topics around, obviously, mental health. And sometimes there's an overlap, but they're very specific, they give you really targeted trainings and no lack of them. So there's my picture. I know that's my Facebook picture. I think it's probably time to get another one. But as I said, I worked for the Northeast and Caribbean ATTC, and I have been in the field for many years. I've done a lot of trainings on substance use, HIV, and I am a vocational rehabilitation counselor by trade. And I worked in drug treatment, helping people find jobs or go back to jobs that they already had and stay in recovery. One of the big reasons I'm interested in this topic is that when we were at NDRI, National Development and Research Institute, which is where we were before we moved uptown to the New York State Psychiatric Institute, we trained for the AIDS Institute. And we spent a lot of time actually developing many courses around methamphetamines and just kind of the history. And depending on, some of you may remember, some of you are younger and may not remember, but around the year 2006, there was a big push or a big trend of using methamphetamines in New York City, by the way. Now, methamphetamines have been used for many, many years, and they've been used all over the country. And depending on where you are, you may have very different experiences with the treatment around methamphetamines. But what we did was, it was probably around 2017, I was working at a place called ACREA, which is an agency. Now it's under GMHC, Gay Men's Health Crisis. And we were asked by the AIDS Institute to update the course on methamphetamines because we wanted to talk about methamphetamine use among MSM. So that's my interest, and one of the reasons I'm here, and I'm really glad to be able to share this information with you. All right, this is just something about the ATTC stimulant work group members, and just so you kind of get a little bit of a history of it. It was established in 2019, and one of the reasons it was established is because, as you know, stimulants have been an epidemic, actually kind of a recurring epidemic in the United States. So the ATTC set up a group of people from all over the country to really update the information. So you could see, I don't know if some of you know Tom Fries or Jeannie or Beth, they did a lot of the work on this. They were the co-chairs and made sure that everything got done in a timely manner. And the members are on the right. And one of the things I think that was important about the whole curriculum is we had people from the University of Washington, we had people from rural sites, we had people from urban sites, so you can get an idea of what's happening where. I will say that in June I will be doing the whole series of 3 days of training on that whole work group. But this is really one of those specific things. And actually, I know this sounds like a lot of talking at the beginning around stimulants, but just so you know, the curriculum, originally it was going to be a day-long curriculum in person. Then what happened? COVID came, and most of us, or many of us, have been working from home. I know that some of you are back in your offices, some of you may not be, but at my job, instead of being at Columbia, we have been working from home. So what we did was we changed the day-long in-person training to 3 modules, 3 virtual modules, and some of you have taken them already, and again I'll be repeating them in June. And in addition, there's a number of supplemental modules and cultural modules. Now what you could do is, if you go to the website, actually it's the ATTC network, I think it's on one of the last slides.org. You can go to their website and you can see which of the supplemental modules are already up there. So you can see there's a number of ones on culture. There's a number of ones that go from everywhere to child welfare, to gender differences, stimulant use, rural versus urban, which we thought was really important, stimulants, and HIV and recovery approaches. And again, in terms of culture, you could see that we've covered the African American population, the American Indian and Alaska Native population, and the Latinx population. So at some point, all of those will be actually on that website, on the national website, and there'll be our presentations that you can listen to whenever you want to. All right, moving along. Many of you have seen this as well. And one of the reasons we put it in every training, and actually every ATTC it puts this in their training, because we want to really talk about some of the values we have about language and how words have power. And we talk about people first. So the people who use methamphetamines, people who use heroin, as opposed to labeling. And the idea with this, by the way, is that hopefully will decrease stigma. And we know that stigma is a big problem in our field, actually probably in the world, but our job in a sense is to reduce stigma. So moving right along. Now, intersectionality, you could see on this piece, I'm going to read a definition of intersectionality. So you could see all those circles. If you look at the bottom, from health beliefs, environment, linguistic characteristics, military service, gender identity, ethnicity, ability, sex, race, age, education, socioeconomics, geography, sexual orientation, and spirituality. And one of the reasons why, let me read this, that the definition of intersectionality, and you've seen this or you will see it in some of the cultural courses that you're taking. I know, for example, Diana Padilla, who is a colleague of mine, who we used to share an office, or we still share an office, she has been doing a lot of trainings on culture. And so when you look at this slide, here's what it means. What it means is that there's an overlap of various social identities, and they contribute to the specific type of systemic oppression and discrimination experienced by an individual. I'm going to read that again. And actually, if you want to type in the chat what comes up for you, and actually this will be the first thing where you could start to think about. The definition of intersectionality is it's an overlap of various social identities. So for example, I might be working with a young man who is African American, who identifies as gay or doesn't identify as gay, who may come from a poor neighborhood and may have been kicked out of his house because of his sexual orientation. So all that together, you can't just take out one of those pieces. All of that together really, it almost reminds me of synergy. You know how sometimes 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2. It can equal 5. And that it sometimes will also help us better acknowledge and ground the differences among us. I'll repeat that. We can better acknowledge and ground the differences among us. So what do you think? Anybody want to write in? You don't have to if you don't want to, but if you've seen this before, what comes to mind when you see this, especially how it's going to go with men who have sex with men? So I will. You can write in your chat anything that comes up for you. Any feelings, thoughts? Have you seen this before? Oh, thanks, my friend Michael McCarthy. Thank you. Stigma. Yeah, so it speaks to, again, the stigma of so many different of those circles. Thank you for writing that. Who else would like to write something? Yes, it does cover so much territory. We'll actually revisit it, and as we go through the course, we can look at how each of those circles kind of gets filled, and they overlap. So somebody said, where is disability? Actually, where it says ability in the top left hand corner there, the idea is about disability. So yes, thank you for asking though, because I think it's important. Somebody says, I've seen this before. It also reminds me of positionality. And it's a very comprehensive, oh good, so it's comprehensive visual, but also easily understandable. I remember when I first heard of it, I saw a woman doing a presentation and she was talking about how her ethnicity was, she was Puerto Rican. She identifies as a lesbian, she had HIV, and she said you couldn't take all of those three things and deal with them individually because that she was the whole person. And obviously, some of that, as I'm looking at the notes around the specific type of systemic oppression and discrimination. So, so just something to think about. And again, you'll get copies of the slides tomorrow. So what are we going to do today? The idea for today is to increase knowledge and awareness of the correlation between methamphetamines and HIV and the associated risk for particular demographic intersections. So I know that's kind of a fancy goal, but we want you to increase your knowledge around what we said was the topic area. Now, by the end of this session, you will be able to, we'll look at the confluence of HIV risk and prevalence of stimulant use, especially among MSM of color. We'll look at actually some specific reasons why methamphetamine use is so prevalent, especially among MSM, men who have sex with men. We'll look at motivations for stimulant use. There's always good reasons why people do what they do, and we'll talk about them. We'll look at the different forms of methamphetamines. We will look also at some evidence-based practices for the treatment of methamphetamines, which is a good thing, by the way, that we'll talk later on that there is no, as of today, there's technically no medication that is helpful, the same way that methamphetamines or buprenorphine is available for opiate use. But we'll talk about what are some of the evidence-based practices. So what are the behavioral pieces that we can teach? We'll also look at the effects of methamphetamines on HIV progression, and we'll also talk about mixing methamphetamines and antiretrovirals. So it's a little bit of everything. All right, so I'm going to ask you to write in again. So this picture talks about linked epidemics, stimulant use disorders, and HIV and AIDS. So as you look at that, what stands out for you? And actually, why does it stand out for you? What stands out for you? Good. AIDS obviously is the biggest thing that one can see. Actually, it is the biggest in terms of size. If you're wondering, by the way, why I keep asking you to write in things, I'm from the school of I think it's better to write in things and participate than to sit. Sometimes when I sit and I'm listening to somebody talk, I start to fall asleep, or I want to check my Facebook or something, or do something else. Yeah, so thank you for writing in. So yes, no cure. And yeah, as of today, there is no cure. The fact that there is still no cure, yes. Increased risk due to various social locations, yes. Stigma definitely stands out. Sharing and no cure. Treatment and no cure. So it seems like what stands out for a lot of people is no cure. It's interesting around COVID and how that, maybe I'll talk about that as we go along, because there's a lot we don't know about COVID still, although there is a vaccine, and I think somewhere up there it says there's no vaccine. Yeah, it says vaccine up there, but there's no vaccine for HIV. Yeah, alternative medicine, opportunistic infections, opportunist discrimination. So it's a little bit of everything. I think when I first saw it, one of the things actually, I used to teach like a lot of HIV 101. And so a lot of the things that we taught around needle sharing, transmission, body fluids, mother to child, breastfeeding, transfusion was what sometimes we would learn, but it's just something to kind of look at the visual. So thank you everybody for writing in. Yes, there have been vaccine trials in the late 1990s and early 2000s for HIV. The big problem is that there's still, it's interesting because there's still no vaccine that really that people have access to. And if you've had the COVID vaccine, by the way, and one of the things when you sign it is that it says this vaccine has not been FDA approved, it's for emergency use, and then you sign your name and get it. And probably will there be a lot more that we learn later on? Yes, but as of today, it seems like a good thing. At least that's my opinion. But yeah, it reminded me of I was on a webinar actually with GMHC, Gay Men's Health Crisis, and it was about HIV and aging. And actually one of the main speakers, actually the keynote speaker, was Dr. Fauci, and people were asking him questions about, if I'm on antiretrovirals, do I have to worry about getting COVID? And what people were saying is that some doctors told their patients that they didn't have to worry about it. But what Dr. Fauci said was, we don't know that yet. So people still, even if you are on antiretrovirals, people still need to maintain social distancing or doing whatever people are doing to stay safe. Yeah, thanks, James, for writing that in. It's mind-boggling to me that we have preventive medications, PrEP and PEP, but no vaccine or cure developed to cure the virus. There's probably a number of reasons why that is. I'm pausing because I don't want to get in trouble for saying anything that'll get me into trouble, but yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, as people are saying, one of my first sets HIV clients was a woman and her child who was infected perinatally by her ex-husband who was an IV drug user. I'm going to say the good news, I can speak for New York, by the way, can't speak for all the other states, but that when women are pregnant and they are given medication while they're pregnant and during delivery, and the baby gets medication afterwards, this is for women who are pregnant who are HIV positive, the transmission to babies has been like 0. And that is really one of the things that is one of the success stories. So yeah, it's kind of a complex thing. So let me go on. Thanks again for writing in, everybody. So we define the term syndemic. Now, before we started writing this, we never talked about pandemic. So we know what pandemic is. Pan means all over the world, but a syndemic is talking two or more afflictions, interacting synergistically, contributing to excess burden of disease in a population. So it's two or more together. So HIV and AIDS and substance use disorder, particularly as it says for intravenous use, are often co-occurring epidemics. And one of the things with syndemics is they share risk factors and causes. And sometimes when you help one, you help the other. Another thing that you could put up there would be HIV and hepatitis C. So that has been defined also as a syndemic. And again, you could see that they have shared risk factors and I guess you could say shared causes as well. So one of the things too we wanted to do with this course is to define MSM of color. So as people know, MSM stands for men who have sex with men. And one of the things that I think is important is it really started as a research term. Like generally people don't go up to, people don't come up to you and say, oh, by the way, I'm an MSM. So it started as research. And one of the ideas was that we wanted to look at not just how people's sexual orientation, about how they identified, but also to look at the behavior. So let's just look at what we have here. So men who have sex with men and other same gender loving men continue to be disproportionately affected by HIV and AIDS, particularly among the Black population. And we'll look at some statistics later on, actually in the next few slides. And there's definitely, as it says, there evolving understandings of the category MSM among Black men to reflect intersections between race, socioeconomic status, sexual behavior, sexuality, subjectivities, and social contact. I think the important thing, or one of the take homes on this, is that when we use the term self-selected identification, what that means is people identify themselves. So it doesn't matter, sometimes when I was doing trainings a while ago, somebody would come up to me, or they'd say in a training, there's this person, this man I'm dealing with, and he is having sex with other men, but he refuses to say he's gay. And they got into this whole thing about a lot of energy around. They wanted him to say that he was gay, and he didn't want to. And the important thing is, people define themselves. So we look at the behaviors again in terms of reducing the risk of HIV, but it's really looking importantly as how people identify themselves. So here's some statistics around HIV infection and transmission. And I think the interesting thing is, as some of you may know, is that for the numbers of HIV have really gone down in the past year, and actually in the past 2 years. And by the way, this comes from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and it was updated in 2020. And what we wanted to, and one of the reasons we have this course, and we think it's important to look at that, is because out of the estimated 1.2 million persons who had HIV, 36,400 were new infections. And here's how the transmission rates broke down. So what we wanted to do, and why you have those boxes around, is that 48% were African American, gay, and bisexual men, and including Latino, gay, and bisexual men. So that's a really high number. And 16% were white, gay, and bisexual men. So we're still talking about high numbers. Oh, thanks. As somebody just wrote in, and I'm going to read this. As a gay man, I first scoffed with the MSM tag like it had been boiled down to function, but I've come to realize its specific rationale. Thanks for saying that. It's funny how sometimes things change. I used to almost like choke when I would say it. And we'd always say, yes, it's a researchy kind of term. But thank you for sharing that. And as a gay man, we appreciate that. The key, by the way, is that, again, the numbers are still very high. Now we'll start to look at that, of why that might be true. And for this course, we'll talk about the different kinds of methamphetamines, although we tend to be looking at, in the MSM community, around crystal meth, and we'll talk about what that is. So men who have sex with men use crystal meth, or they're at higher risk of HIV infection. We already showed you the numbers. Viral hepatitis, also another high one, and other diseases transmitted sexually or through IV drug use. So it's the kind of the use of crystal meth, and we'll talk about how people use it and why that may put people at risk. It also says that MSM who use social media, which is a good way to meet people. I'm saying that because I am of an age where I don't do that, but for many people, when I was working at Acrea, I did a lot of training with a lot of young men of color, and so they really would tell me like the real deal. And one of the things we know is that when a population is stigmatized, it's easier to connect with somebody through social media. And so that puts people at high risk. Now, again, these are just some of the numbers. We had some of the charts, and it kind of supports what we were saying. But HIV diagnoses, new diagnoses in 2018, 69% were among gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men. 24% were heterosexual and 7% were from people who injected drugs. I think the interesting thing is for those of you who worked in drug treatment, and I think some of you who are on this webinar work in methadone maintenance, is that what really has worked for people who inject drugs, especially for people who inject heroin, is that teaching people about safer injection practices and actually syringe exchange has really brought down the numbers to really low. And I think that is important to look at. Yes, I believe the acronym Party and Play. Yeah, Party and Play indicates meth and sex on social media. Yes. And, you know, it's interesting too, as friends of mine who've been on Grindr will tell me that, you know, when somebody says, really, if you want to party and play, the expectation is that there will be meth use and sex. So yes, PNP. Thanks for writing that in, Michael. Here's some more charts, and you know, we've been talking about some of the numbers. You know, one of the numbers that actually, like, if you look at the pie chart, you could see, by the way, that obviously with African Americans, it's that darker blue, 37%, Hispanics, Latinos, 29%. So you add up those two numbers, they're really high. With whites, 28%. And for people who identify as multiple races or Asians, American Indians, the numbers are smaller. But one of the things I think that's important is a lot of them are adolescents. And as it says at the bottom, in 2017, adult and adolescent gay and bisexual men made up to 70% of the new diagnoses in the United States. So I think I'm giving you enough like statistics. So let's look at some stimulant use patterns. The specificity of prevalence rates within this population, it's limited as data is often not, you know, what's happens sometimes when people do studies, it's not always aggregated by sexual orientation. So sometimes you have to take that with a grain of salt. But the prevalence of stimulant use among MSM has been shown to be 20 times that of the general population. So I think that's, the numbers are really high on that. Now, you can't really talk about this population and really not deal with trauma. And if you haven't taken a course in trauma, I'd suggest people do, or a course in trauma-informed care, because the high rates of trauma among MSM are very high. And if you look at kind of the reaction, as you know, to homophobia, to discrimination, or violence experienced due to their sexual orientation. So the numbers are high. If you want to get a free book, or now you can download it, the tips, actually, I'm going to write that in the chat. Tip 57. Tip 57, TIP stands for Treatment Improvement Protocol, and they come from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and it is a book that is free, and it is on trauma-informed care, and it's on trauma and behavioral treatment. But it's really good to read it or to use it for those of you who are doing trainings, because one of the things they look at is, in terms of how do you define trauma, they have the 3 E's. And the first E stands for an event. So it could be an event or it could be a series of events. So some of your clients have been sexually abused over a number of years, so that would be a series. Sometimes it's a single event of sexual assault, or it could be anything like getting kicked out of your home or not having enough food to eat. And so the E is, the first E is for event, the second E is for experience. So what that means is that everybody's going to have a different reaction. And when people have, let's say, for example, support systems, and they experience a trauma, they may not have long-lasting effects for them. On the other hand, it might. It's one of those, my trainer answers are, it depends. And that the 30 stands for long-lasting effects. So for example, sometimes people go through a trauma, they get over it fairly quickly, and they integrate it, and it doesn't become part of kind of their history. What we say is that assume that 99% of your clients have experienced trauma, and that's for everybody across the board. That includes us, by the way. And so I think it's important for us. I used to teach at NYU for a while, and I used to tell my students or encourage them to get therapy for any of their traumas or things, because if you don't deal with your own stuff, it'll come out in your work. So hopefully you can get help with that. But assume that everybody who comes to see you, and there's a term called complex trauma, and complex means that there's people have had a series of events that have been not integrated. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine who's kind of near my age grew up, he went to Catholic school. He kept hearing that being gay was a mortal sin, and he knew that he liked men and he didn't like women. His parents sent him to conversion therapy, which is really horrible. And also he was bullied a lot. Later on, he got into a relationship where there was intimate partner violence. And so it's a whole series of things. And now he's dealing with a lot of those different kinds of traumas. So it's important to kind of look at that. And trauma, so we'll see on the next slide. Trauma and HIV, as it says there, individuals with HIV are disproportionately affected by trauma. And whenever you see these studies, sometimes the numbers are really low because people don't report them. So 50% of individuals with HIV have a history of childhood sexual or physical abuse. And one of the things you'll find with trauma in men is that the numbers are always a lot less than trauma for women. Does that mean that men experience less traumas? I don't know, but it also means that maybe people don't report them. So for men to report traumas, like having been sexually abused as a child, may be very difficult for men to do. 90% of individuals with HIV have at least experienced one significant traumatic experience. And even though we're not talking about women in this course, 55% of women with HIV experience intimate partner violence. And it's the term, by the way, for domestic violence that's now called intimate partner violence. And one of the things I think to keep in mind is that in the LGBTQ community, there's high levels of intimate partner violence, but one of the things is people don't always they don't always take it seriously. So when one man is beating another man and calls the police, what do the police think? Oh, why can't he take care of himself? When two women are fighting and the police get called, sometimes people think, oh, this is like a cat fight, or this is cute, or I don't get this. So I think it's just important to kind of really look at that. So the numbers, again, are high. And yeah, thanks, Michael, for writing that in. High levels of IPV and low levels of programming and case finding. Absolutely. I would say, and I always used to tell people, keep your antenna up, because a lot of times people want to tell you something and they're waiting for you to ask. And, traditionally, somebody comes into your office and they have black and blue marks and you can see them. That's one thing. But a lot of those traumas or those beatings are hidden. And also, when you look at verbal abuse, which is also really, which is a trauma, you don't see that when you talk to somebody. So we know that trauma and substance use has gone together, and there have been many studies on that for many years. And it doesn't mean, but so it says there, the experience of addiction may be traumatic in of itself, since it can put people in dangerous situations and affect health status. So sometimes, so maybe using the substance is not the trauma, but getting or copying or getting this substance puts people at risk, or people become infected with HIV or other illnesses. And so there's just a whole, I'm going to say the numbers are staggering. And this was a quote that somebody said, you know, initially alcohol and other drugs saved my life. Then later they turned on me. So one of the reasons people use drugs at the beginning is why they work. They make you feel better. The problem is after a while, you get the opposite. All right, moving right along. So I think this is an important part as we look at chemsex, and you can't talk about MSM and methamphetamines without looking at, again, the connection to sex. And what we have, by the way, up there is the Center for Health Identity, Behavior and Prevention, studies of meth use among MSM. It used to be at NYU, by the way, but then the dean of the School of Public Health actually changed schools and went to Rutgers. So now it's at Rutgers. So it's Dr. Perry Halkitis. And they've been doing actually a lot of research during the pandemic, by the way. They've been doing research. And let me just throw in that they have done, for those of you who live in New Jersey, they've done a survey of LGBT affirming health services in New Jersey. And I think that's important to know. So yes, go to their website and you could see what they're up to. Oh yeah, let me see what people are writing in. Yeah, yes, verbal and emotional abuse with our patients. Absolutely, Gladys. And that, you know, one of the things, it doesn't look like scars, but we know that it causes trauma as well. Too many silos between, oh yes, 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 that's the problem. Too many silos between the different agencies. Well, all I can think of is saying, like, yikes, it's unfortunate that happened since it's so common. I once worked on a program many years ago from an organization called CASA, the Center for Addiction and Substance Abuse, and I actually was out of Columbia University, and we worked on a women's program in 13 sites throughout the country. And what they did was they got together. It was for women who were using drugs and on welfare and were parents. They got together, actually, the people who worked in the welfare agency, the people who worked in, then they called it domestic violence, the people who worked with employment and substance abuse treatment, so that they could work with women in the whole picture. I think what they found was that it worked. They didn't have somebody at the time dealing with mental health, and they said if they were to go back again, they would do that as well. So going to this is that it's kind of the context of meth use, and like, why do you need to know this? Sometimes I think it's important to look at where people are using, who they are using with. So you could see as the bullets, you know, at a lover or friend's house, at a bar, at a bathhouse, at home alone. The reason I think it's important to look at home alone is because many people have told me, and this is anecdotal, by the way, but they've told me in trainings that once they got addicted and they were seriously into meth, they didn't want to share. And they just would spend the whole time, like a whole weekend, at home using meth and looking at porn. So people use a variety of things. One thing, some of you know this too from drug treatment, is that usually when there's stimulant drugs, there is sometimes, I shouldn't be using the word addiction because it's not in the DSM-5, but there's a dependence, let's say, or there is an issue with sex. The DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, does not consider, at least the 5, does not consider sexual addiction a diagnosis, although the ICD, the International, all of a sudden I spaced on, the ICD codes that you use, they look at it. And I think in DSM-6, you'll see that. But it really speaks to, again, of dealing with, you almost can't deal with you can't deal with substance if you don't deal with sex. Now, yeah, I know ICD codes now it's under OCD. It's one of those things too, if you go into treatment and you want your insurance company to pay for it, that's always a tricky one, right? So yeah, now it's under, thank you for writing that. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that methamphetamine use is used with other substances. And I'm going to say I found that a couple of things I found out. In New York, when I was training, many of the people who were using meth were also looking at using GHB, or alcohol is not in there, but that was another one, and marijuana. Oh, let's see what. Yeah, again, it's that whole thing about a legitimate diagnosis. I'm with you on that one. I think the challenge is, and actually some of the treatment programs that are, I'm going to say, gay friendly and or treat crystal meth do deal with the sexual piece on that. Because it becomes a relapse trigger. It's the connection. And, it's always been a connection, for example, between cocaine and sex. And now with methamphetamines, definitely um, bigger. Um, when I was training in Buffalo a couple of years ago, people who were using meth were also using heroin. So it's kind of that, that combination where sometimes people will use a stimulant drug and then they'll follow it with a depressant drug to kind of cut the high. I will say, and this is from some of the other courses, the challenge, by the way, of people using heroin and meth together is that they can't tell when they're overdosing. So sometimes if somebody, let's say their first drug is heroin, they're using meth, they feel mellow, but they also feel kind of excited. They don't realize that their breathing is beginning to stop. So that is something to look at. Another thing, Viagra is up on that list. And one of the things to keep in mind, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is that for some men, I'll talk about it now actually, some men get what's called crystal dick. And I'm not saying that to be gratuitous. I'm saying that because for men, after a while, they won't be able to get an erection. So they'll take the Viagra, but sometimes mixing Viagra with a stimulant drug can be dangerous. And also, depending on other health problems a person may have, it can be dangerous. Okay, I'm reading what people are writing in. Thanks, Michael. The problem is that the view is that it has a monocytic etiology. Yeah, it's often a symptom of different disorders, neurological and yeah, it's all of the above. And I think that's why it's really complex. Let's also, thanks, Doreen. Also, oops, sorry. Somebody wrote about the cultural aspects of different substances in, yeah, you know what? I'm going to talk about that actually on the next page, because one of the things too is in some cultures, there is, I guess I'm going to say like less acceptance of a person coming out, and that causes, again, I've got some slides on homophobia, internal and external. So thanks again for writing that in. So actually, let's go to, I'm going to ask you to write in is, actually, why do MSM use amphetamines and methamphetamines? And one of the things too, if you've been in my courses, we often talk about a biopsychosocial spiritual concept of substance use. So why do you think, or what do you know about MSM using methamphetamines or amphetamines? Now, many people use them, but what might be specific for MSM? So if you would write in, why do people use meth? And I'm talking methamphetamines, not methadone. Thank you. Yes, the club culture. It's part of the culture. Thank you. Oh, are you talking, Michael, about you're talking about in the DSM-3? Oh, as a disorder. You're talking about sexual addiction. Okay. Thanks for other people writing it. To enhance the pleasure and performance, to heighten pleasurable effects, to decrease inhibitions from internalized homophobia. Thank you for the pleasure. The rapid feelings of exhilaration associated with pleasure. Everybody else is doing it's their drug of choice. Pleasure and recreation, sex work increases self-esteem for the moment. Anybody else? Because or I'll show you what we have on the next slides. So I broke it down actually. Yeah, emotional numbing, absolutely. To not feel. Thank you for writing that in, Crystal. I have slides, by the way, where I break it down into biological aspects, to psychological and social. And a lot of times they overlap. But think about actually the use of any stimulant drug. You don't have to answer this, but did anybody have coffee today? If you could see my face, I'm raising my hand. In fact, I had a little bit of coffee before I started the presentation, thinking I need to make sure that I can focus, although it's usually not too difficult to focus because there's a certain amount of adrenaline. But you know how sometimes you wake up and you go, oh, I got to drink a lot of coffee today. Oh, you don't have to be guilty, by the way. To me, coffee is one of those good drugs. But anyway, the reason I'm asking is that sometimes people use stimulant drugs. Why? To focus, to lose weight. Now, for a while, a lot of times, and actually diet drugs actually are amphetamines or like similar to methamphetamines. But when I worked in women's programs, they would often talk about, oh, I only wanted to lose 5 pounds. Now, in the gay community, it's important to look good. And so for many people, for men, to lose weight is one of the reasons. To stay awake, to increase stamina, and it could be, again, the stamina for having a lot of sex. Yes, ADHD drugs are also stimulants. And that's why sometimes college students use them to study, which is not a commercial for that. But I know that that happens to be true. So they increase your stamina, they increase the energy and desire for sex, and they prolong the sexual experience at the beginning. So you think about this, these are all things that look pretty pleasurable. And so one could understand initially why people might want to use methamphetamines. All right, let's go to the next one. So what are some psychological reasons? To feel accepted, to increase self-confidence. One of the things about stimulant drugs is they make you feel competent, confident, energetic, personable. They make you feel pretty. They make you feel handsome. And so it may be like fake self-confidence, but initially they make you feel good. A big one for many people is to cope with the stigma and internalized homophobia. And you know, again, and I know I've got some of my some people in the Bronx. I'm thinking of situations where when I was training, a lot of times we'd have young people coming to the training and they had gotten kicked out of their homes when they were 13 and came out. And so the way of coping with the stigma or the internalized, maybe it's gone inside, was a reason for them to use. It acts as an antidepressant to escape reality and to deal with the feelings of trauma. So psychological are definitely, it has to do with some of the feelings and thoughts people might have. Now, social, to be more outgoing. You know, sometimes people say that they're really shy and then they have a drink or they use methamphetamines and all of a sudden they're very friendly. That may be one of the reasons, to relax inhibitions, to feel accepted by the group. Yes, Michael, I agree with you. I like the you like the numbing comment, since dissociative symptoms from trauma are often manifested as psychic numbing. Yep. Same is true about alcohol. Yes. And that's why sometimes you'll see an overlap. What's that? There's a term about, you know how you have somebody. I remember once many years ago at a holiday party where I worked, not at this current job, but somebody started, they were really shy all the time, and then they started drinking, and then all of a sudden they were like dancing on a table, and no one had seen a person do this. So sometimes alcohol alcohol is a disinhibitory drug. So it speaks to, again, all of the social reasons, and to search for belonging in the Black gay community and to escape loneliness. So there's biological reasons why, there's psychological, and there's social. So as you're looking at that, I know some of you are writing in some comments. The reason we put it there is that, again, people use for a variety of reasons. And again, at the beginning they work, and then after a while they don't work as much, or they don't work as well. But for people to get, everybody wants to belong to something or to search for belonging. And so I think that's an important piece as well. So this is this is as when I said there's going to be pictures, these are as picturesque as we're going to get, but I think it's important to look at, I'm kind of segueing into some information around methamphetamines, and this will depend on where you live. So for example, the methamphetamine powder tends to be in the Midwest and the West Coast, and that's where a lot of the methamphetamines are. The base or the paste, you may not see that a lot. It's not as common. And it's not common in the MSM community. And, when I'm talking about sometimes the MSM community, I was thinking of where the research has been done. It's like New York, Buffalo, DC, Atlanta, Chicago, LA, San Francisco. Yeah, the feeling of loneliness is an important factor also, definitely. So when you think about, again, when something you take fills a need, or the perception is that it feels a need, you can understand. And like, look what's happened this year. So many people have relapsed who were in recovery, again, because of the loneliness or the isolation. It's interesting because adults have relapsed a lot. Adolescents, not so much, because they didn't have as much access to substances. So going back to the slide, though, crystal meth is often what we're talking about in the gay community. And I don't know if you have good pictures there, but it's a white, clear crystal rocks. It looks like crushed glass or rock salt, so it's kind of attractive. And that is often what is used in the MSM community. Now, what are the differences in terms of patterns of use? Or actually, no, let me. Oh, this is pattern of use. When you ask people, and I know many of you always ask people, how do they use? It's always important to know the route of administration, because it can tell you about addiction potential. It can tell you about other health risks. And this may vary according to where you live, by the way, is that for many places that where I've worked, people were either smoking or injecting, because when you do smoke or inject, you get it kicks in really, really fast. The problem is it kicks in fast, but doesn't last really long. Other ways of taking it, and this is from like Substance Use 101, you can snort it, and it produces effects within 3 to 5 minutes. One of the challenges of snorting crystal meth is that because it's like glassy substance, it can cause people to get really bleeding in their nostrils. That's really unnoticeable. You can eat it also, by the way. And actually, some of the pills, I've seen this in some of women's programs where they took pills, and it's like a lot of things, it kicks in 15 to 30 minutes. Methamphetamine tends to be really binged, where people will use what they have, go on a run, and then stop and sleep for a while. And one thing that's not up there is something called booty bumping. I don't know if some of you have heard of this, but it's another common way of using methamphetamines where the methamphetamine actually is placed in the butt, in the anus. And because the anus has a lot of capillaries, somebody can get high from that. It's kind of like a suppository. Part of the reason people like that, yeah, you can do that with coke too. You can do it with a lot of drugs, by the way. I remember a student said they did it with ecstasy. I've heard that when people are in prison, you can do it with alcohol. And yeah, no, it's good to learn something new every day. I think sometimes what I find is that, like, if people think, oh, you know about booty bumping, and they look at me and go, you know about booty bumping. I think it's important. And again, from a health point of view, one of the things that happens with booty bumping is often like part of the sexual experience, so that maybe the partner puts the drug into his partner's anus. Actually, it could be with women as well, by the way. And then that becomes part of the quote intimacy. Oh yeah, the thing with the needle, you can do with a syringe, but here's the trick, and I'm glad you brought this up. Take the needle off. So people do it with a syringe. Take the needle off. You could also do it with your finger. Sometimes people will actually, I think it's called parachuting, where you wrap the drug in some like Kleenex, and this way it'll still take effect, but it won't cause any bleeding or any sores. Oh yeah, benzodiazepines for crashes. It's always like what goes up must come down. So if people go up with the drug, then what are they going to take to go down? The opposite. So sometimes Valium, if you get access to Valium, Xanax, for the crash, alcohol, because it's easy to get. And so, yeah, thanks. Thanks. Is it pronounced Mayana? Thank you for the needle thing, because I think that's, from a harm reduction point of view, that's an important thing. So thank you for bringing that up. So different kinds of use. And as we said, sometimes you ask people, obviously, because you want to know where they are in terms of their use, and also kind of what setting they're using in. Now, I'm going to segue to, or change, just I don't know if it's going to be on Jeopardy if the topic is methamphetamines and they ask you about this. These are some tidbits, but I think they're important to look at, because especially if you're in the Midwest where people were making methamphetamines at home. In 2005, Congress passed the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act. What did that mean? It meant that you couldn't go into the pharmacy and buy lots of Sudafed. Even now, don't you have to show your driver's license to get some of that heavy duty Sudafed? And they stopped that because they wanted to stop the home manufacture of methamphetamines. There's something called smurfing. And I don't really know about the Smurfs, by the way, but I do know that smurfing is when a bunch of people go to pharmacies looking for Sudafed. So if I'm a dealer and I have 10 friends, I ask them to go to 10 different facilities, any pharmacy, buy some Sudafed and bring it back to me. Yeah, and if it's behind the counter, like, you're never going to see Sudafed at Costco where you can buy a lot. But anyway, when they stopped that, that really changed how people got the drug. And actually what really happened after that, but they say the public forgot about the drug, but I don't think so, because I know there was a lot of treatment programs still working on it. And that a lot of the methamphetamines that we use today come from Mexico, and from the drug cartels. It said improving production using the P2P method. P2P stands for phenylacetone. So it's just a different, instead of using Sudafed, it's a different kind of, a precursor for use of the drugs. All right. So what are some of the differences in patterns of use? with methamphetamines versus cocaine. Now, let me just say that my favorite trainer answer is it depends. So sometimes I could tell you what this is and somebody might do the opposite. But here's some of the generalizations that have come about around people who use methamphetamine, taking the drug at the beginning of the day and additional doses at 2 to 4 intervals throughout the day. Methamphetamine has a higher half-life, so it lasts longer. When I worked in programs, in women's programs, women wanted to be kind of the super mom, and so they would take the drug at the beginning of the day so that they could take care of their kids, they could go to drug treatment, they could go to work, they could go to school, and always produce. And for people who use cocaine, tends to be taken in the evening and additional doses continuously over a period of several hours. So it actually has a shorter half-life, meaning it doesn't stay in your system as long. It doesn't kick in as long. Now, here's something I think that's really, interesting about methamphetamines, and there'll be 2 slides. And, they've done studies on food and sex and how much dopamine that produces. And remember, dopamine is the pleasure neurotransmitter. And yes, we want to get dopamine. Anytime you do anything pleasurable, you are accessing dopamine in your system. But they started with food and sex because food and sex are necessary for survival. And here's what they did. So we're looking at dopamine. On the left-hand side, they had, they did animal studies, by the way, and you may have feelings about that, but they did studies. I guess they made the rats not eat, and then when they ate, you could see that the dopamine levels went up to about 150. That was the output. With sex, they had sex-deprived animals, and when they had sex, you could see that the numbers went up to 200. All right, so hang on to those numbers. So 150 for food, 200 for sex. Now let's look at dopamine release on some drugs. So with alcohol, you could see top left-hand corner, 200 units of dopamine. Nicotine goes up higher. It's between 200 and 250. Bottom left-hand corner, we've got cocaine, which goes up to about 350. But methamphetamine, you could have actually made you could have used like a whole page on this, because when people used methamphetamines, it went up to approximately 1,300 units of dopamine. So think about that. If you took something that gave you 1,300 units of dopamine, you would experience extreme pleasure. And so that's why people use it. So when people always say, I don't get why he's using, it's all in his head. Well, it's in a person's brain. It's really important to kind of look at that. Oh yeah, curiosity gives us dopamine bumps too. You know what? There's a lot of things you can do to increase your own dopamine. And I'll tell you them right now. First of all, because I think it's important in this pandemic. One is find things that are pleasurable for you. And that could be anything. If it's eating a hot fudge sundae or chocolate, dopamine. Good sex, dopamine. A hot bath, dopamine. A massage, dopamine. Other things, so for Michael's, you're written for you, curiosity. I just think it speaks to sometimes, like with massages, for those of you who had babies, how some of those baby blankets on the side, they have that satin on the side. That's the baby's way of actually, as the baby touches some of that, it becomes pleasurable for them and they're accessing their dopamine. So you don't have to worry about a drug problem, but it's just something. The challenge, by the way, with dopamine is almost anything you do will not be equivalent to using methamphetamines as far as dopamine output. So I think it's just important to look at that, of why it becomes a problem. Now, I'm going to kind of segue, or I'm changing course on what works. And I wanted to talk, I guess, briefly about a couple of things that work. And I know I've got like tons of slides left, but if you're familiar with contingency management is something that really like started in the 80s. And what it meant is that when you changed a behavior, you got a reward. And it's kind of like certain styles. It's back in vogue again. So contingency management has been used for methamphetamines. Oh, that's a good question. How long does the dopamine effect last with methamphetamine? It depends on kind of what goes up will go down afterwards. So, and for those of you who are in recovery from methamphetamines, if you want to write in privately what the dopamine effect, but it doesn't last really, really long. That's the problem. I can't give you like a time frame, but usually what'll happen is people will take more. Let me just be clear that with cocaine, you would want to take cocaine more quickly than methamphetamines. Some methamphetamines actually would last like 24 hours. So if like the half-life, that would mean that you would probably experience it for like 8 hours. But some of you can disagree with me on that one, by the way, because I've talked to different women who've used it, and I've talked to different men and gotten different answers. But thanks for asking that. So going back to contingency management, it's really having patients adhering to a targeted behavior. And it's got to be something like if you're going to get a reward, like sometimes people will work in a treatment center. One group I worked with once decided that if they all didn't use this substance, they would have a pizza party at the end of the week. Now, you have to like pizza for that. It can't be something like you get liver if you hate liver. Let me go back to this. Yeah, thanks, Michael. Oh, that dopamine is short acting without meth. Yeah. Not sure about with meth, but I'll get you get your curiosity fixed by looking that up, and then you can email that to me. You know what? It's interesting too, because if you do something pleasurable, during the pandemic, see what's working for you. Sometimes like you listen to music and it's like, oh, dopamine. And then the song goes off and you're like, okay, I'm still in the pandemic. But the key, I think, is to kind of get the baseline and keep it up. And that's what self-care is really about. So I'm going to just say contingency management. They're going to actually probably be courses on this. The key, by the way, is that, as I said, you get a positive reinforcement for desired behaviors. The key, by the way, and in the other course we get into it in greater detail, is that you can't have some of the prizes. They can't cost a lot of money depending on if person's on Medicaid. And sometimes people don't like it because they say, why should we give people presents, or gifts for not doing something that they're not supposed to do in the first place? The key, by the way, is that it's good in early recovery. It's good in early recovery. And I also think, and you don't have to answer this question, but do you ever do this? You say to yourself, if I get through my course at school, I'm going to buy myself a present. Or if I get through my week at work, I'm going to give myself a good dinner. So in a way, we do contingency management for ourselves. And for those of you who work in education, yeah, it is positive reinforcement. And oh yeah, gift cards. And now it's good because people like gift cards. And the key is you need to get the money for the gift cards. But yes, many of us like gift cards. So I think that's been working, and it's been working again in early recovery. So I'm going to say when I do the course in June, if you want to take day 3 is really all about treatment. Now, here's the quick answer about, are there medications for the treatment of stimulant use disorder? Here's the short answer, no, unfortunately. What I will say is that you may have heard of some of the clinical trials, and this is what they're using. They're using naltrexone, so like Vivitrol, and bupropion, which is an antidepressant. So the combination, they think, may work, but according to Tom Fries, we can't really say that, oh, this is definite, but you're going to see. And when I've done courses, I know that this is what some people have used. So it's kind of like off label, but you may see that hopefully in the future. Yeah, if contingency management is used by some methadone clinics, that would make a lot of sense. So it actually is an evidence-based practice for substance use in general. It's just that sometimes something will be popular and then it won't be popular, and this one is popular again. Thanks for writing that in. Now, another thing that has been used, and this is also evidence-based for substance use. Yeah, Wellbutrin is the brand name. You know how there's always like the bupropion is the fancy name and the brand name, and so it always gets kind of confusing as to what's the brand name. It's kind of like Jello and gelatin. Jello is the brand name, but everybody calls Jello gelatin Jello. So yeah, Wellbutrin. Wellbutrin also has been used with a different name called Chantix for smoking cessation. I know that for some people it's caused people to have suicidal ideation, but it's just it's the companies actually trying to figure out kind of new ways for them to use their new and different ways to market. So thank you for writing that in, because I think that's really helpful. Thanks, Michael. And again, kind of going to cognitive behavioral therapy. Let me say too that CBT, as we often talk about it, is one of the evidence-based practices for substance use and has been used very successfully with methamphetamines. There's also something, and you can get this from SAMHSA. I hope it's still there for free, but it was called Gay Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. And one of the things about CBT is that, as it says there, the underlying assumption is that it's a learning process. So when people use CBT, you go to like 12 sessions and it's like being in school. Like one might be returning home to your family for the holidays. It's all again pre-COVID. Or actually now people are getting nervous about going back to social things that they haven't done in a year. So CBT really, so the cool thing I think about it is you can teach people to do it. Relapse prevention is a really kind of the use of cognitive behavioral therapy. So you know, sometimes people will avoid situations that are triggers for them, or how to cope when there are triggers, all part of CBT. I think the good thing about the gay cognitive behavioral therapy is that it's manualized, and that all the case studies have people who are gay in them. So you don't have to take some manual and then change it from a man and a woman, because you've got cases that are man and man, or a woman and a woman. And I think that is really helpful. And they'll have like actually a lot of information about coming out and what that means to people as well. So I'm going to say Google it. I haven't downloaded it in a while, and sometimes I like to do that when I'm doing a training, and I just didn't do it. But I know that Tom Fries has talked about it a lot. So CBT. Now, here's another thing. Who likes to exercise? You don't have to answer that. But they did some studies about, seems so simple, by the way, right? That research has demonstrated that if people do aerobics, it improves depression, anxiety, cognitive deficits, and substance use outcomes. And I think that's important to look at as well. And hopefully some of you have figured that out during the pandemic, around when I've done courses on self-care. Everybody's been walking or doing Zumba, or trying to figure out ways to get exercise in. And what they did was they did a study. It was done in the United States. And oh yeah, and dealing with PTSD. Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely. Thank you, Michael, for writing that in. But it speaks to, again, of they had a control group. They had one group that did exercise 3 times a week, and one group that just got education. And they found, by the way, that people did a lot better, and there was less methamphetamine use when people exercised. I was asking Tom if they did, I said 3 times a week, how long? You know, does it have to be 20 minutes, 30 minutes? He didn't know, but in China, they did a study, same thing with exercise, and they said 20 minutes at a session. So you can add that to your with 20 minutes, by the way, you get endorphins of whatever you do aerobically. So I think that's important. So exercise has been shown to work. And there's just, again, some of the numbers. One of the reasons I'm starting to go a little fast is because I have a number of slides I want to make sure I get to. But the good news is that fewer people return to meth use, which I think is really great. And, you know, how do they self-report? Through urine testing. And so the important thing is, and I don't know, I've been to residential treatment centers where people do a lot of exercise, or they will also have people walking around and doing things. Yes, deep breathing and mindfulness exercises. Yes, definitely. Actually, those, they didn't do study for this study, they didn't do it, but deep breathing and mindfulness is definitely research-based, actually, for all substances. And one of the reasons why deep breathing can be really helpful, it was done a while ago around relapse prevention, is that if somebody had a craving and they started doing deep breathing, that the craving would decrease. And, you know, you just want to delay it. So yeah, and mindfulness, definitely, there's a lot of research out there about, you know, about mindfulness. You do a whole course on it almost. There's this guy, he used to, there's a man named Doug Zadonis. He used to teach at Rutgers. Now he's in San Diego, and he's done a lot of his studies on mindfulness. And many of you who are therapists have used that as well. Okay, so I'm kind of flipping back to when we're talking about the MSM, is to look at the impact of homophobia. And we know, for example, so you can look at external and internal. So the range of negative attitudes and feelings towards homosexuality are people who are identified or perceived as LGBT. So it comes from a lot of outside sources. And again, I'm kind of stuttering, but I was thinking somehow in this political climate, people are very anti-LGBT, or at least it's coming out on television and in different laws around people who are transgender in sports and all of that. So homophobia is real, so it comes from outside, but an important thing too is that it can come from inside. And, you know, for example, a friend of mine told a story about when he was always at church and he kept hearing how gay people were bad or evil, and he knew that he was gay. He just, after a while, he internalized that, and it kind of turned in on himself, you know, and resulted in actually a diagnosis of depression and a host of other health issues. So I think it's important to kind of look at, kind of go back to why do MSM use substances? You know, we're talking about biopsychosocial. If you can be part of a group, you feel accepted, you can forget about the homophobia that's going on. It can be really helpful. And this is kind of looking at intersectionality revisited. So you could kind of think about that, of many people. Yeah, and actually, yeah, minority stress is a whole area of inquiry. Absolutely. And, you know, I was thinking about, I think I was looking at something the other day. Oh, well, think about it. For those of you who have to worry about when you leave your house, whether you're going to get stopped by the policeman or get into trouble for anything, for just walking down the street or going into a store. So it is really, I think, important, actually, in a lot of our courses on trauma. And I think actually with MSM of color to look at that, and thanks, because that brings it back to the intersectionality. So it's a whole piece around sexual orientation, around race, age, sex. Look what's happening today with people who are Asian American and who are experiencing violence. So you just leave your house and you have to kind of look around and figure out. Actually, a friend of mine who's a therapist who has a number of clients who are Asian American, she said she was struggling with, part of her work is to make people feel safe, from a clinical point of view. But she also has to realize that for some people, this not being safe on the street is real. And what do you do with that? And you have to live with that for a long period of time. So yes, definitely. So going back to methamphetamine and its impact on HIV infection, some of this I've mentioned already. One of the things I think it's important to look at, again, why do people use it? To lower sexual inhibitions, to kind of lower one's judgment about that, to have the confidence and energy to engage in sexual activity for a long period of time. So sometimes when people talk about doing those weekends on Fire Island, people would tell me that some of the men who would go there would talk about being able to have sex, I don't know, 36 times within a 24-hour period, or a lot of sex in a short period of time. And so that would be one of the reasons why people might want to use. But as I said before, it ultimately, what helped at the beginning to be able to sustain an erection and have lots of sex for many men results in erectile dysfunction. So the challenge with that whole thing about the term crystal dick, what it means is that a man cannot get an erection but still has the desire to have sex. So you could think about that as well. It can cause mucosal dryness. So that speaks to, again, around anal sex, what could happen in terms of tears or some of the or bleeding around that. And it decreases adherence to HIV. It may decrease adherence to HIV treatment. I'm going to say that one thing some of you may be familiar with is that now a lot of the antiretrovirals are going to be injectable, meaning you would get an injection once a month or every other month. And the company that's made them says it's like a game changer. And I was talking to a friend of mine who said, yeah, I'd rather get an injection once a month than have to take all these pills every day. So you'll see that, and actually that could help with, actually it will help with adherence. Other things to keep in mind are, I think we already went over this actually a lot, but the rates of HIV seroprevalence have been reported. Again, the numbers are really high. And again, it's that connection between amphetamine or methamphetamine use, high-risk sexual behavior, and HIV transmission in the MSM communities. And so that becomes, again, an issue. All right, so methamphetamines and HIV. The last 4 bullets deal just with methamphetamines, and the first one deals with cocaine as well as methamphetamines. And you may have heard this before, that for some people, occasional use of meth can cause faster weight loss and vitamin depletion. So now this is weight loss without wanting to lose weight. And again, what happens is that HIV can grow very quickly with cocaine and methamphetamines. And so again, we've kind of repeated this around people taking the antiretrovirals, may not take them. And another thing with methamphetamines is that for many people, this is for men and women, by the way, is that sometimes you'll see greater neuronal injury, which means that not just the neurotransmitters are affected, but the neurons themselves in one's central nervous system. And that can cause, again, some cognitive impairment. It can accelerate dementia. I mean, the good news about a lot of the antiretrovirals is that they stopped dementia for many people. When I started in the field, sometimes I'd be dealing with somebody who was 32 years old and was dealing with dementia. The antiretrovirals have really helped them. So, but mixing it with methamphetamines can again accelerate the dementia, and again increases viral replication. And in an ideal world, you want people to have you don't want to have increased viral replication. You want the medications actually to keep the growing of HIV to a minimum. All right, some more, and this comes from NIDA. These are some of the things, you know, you kind of look at from a, I'm going to say from a like a trainer or a counselor point of view, because it may impact everyday cognitive symptoms. What does that mean? Somebody says, you say to somebody, well, let's talk tomorrow at 10 o'clock. I'll call you, or we'll set up a Zoom call, and then they totally forget. Or maybe they had high cognitive functioning before they started with the medications, and then it starts to decrease. That can also impede or include things like activities of daily living, ADLs. So it could be medication management, but it could be as something simple as grocery shopping, planning social activities, bathing, dressing. I mean, those are all things that I won't say we take for granted, but sometimes we take for granted. But if they're impacted, then it may affect that, as well as employment. And I am a big believer in employment and actually living with HIV and substance use as a way to actually stay healthy. All right. You know, it's like the almost we're kind of in the home stretch, so we're looking at, and actually this is just a picture of the brain, which was what I just said in the previous slide. So HIV and meth are thought to have synergistic cognitive and neurological impacts. So, you know, synergism is 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2. You don't know really what could happen. And this is not the picture of the brain, but this is what happens with HIV and methamphetamine. So again, I mean, one of the things, again, we talked about greater dopamine release, but it could be, again, cellular damage as a result of that. And it could affect, again, the frontal cortex. The cortex is really what deals with your kind of, they call it like your executive functioning, like your ability to make a judgment, ability to make a decision. And I've probably said many times, difficulty in adhering to the medications, and just again, deficits in attention, working memory, abstract decision making. I know as a vocational rehab counselor, sometimes what would happen is when somebody was using methamphetamines, when they came into treatment, they had, let's say, an 8th grade reading level or a 12th grade reading level, and they were very functional. And then after using for a while, it's not that the reading level went down, but the ability actually to process information decreased. And so you'd make a referral to a training program that you thought they could get into, and they would get into it, but they couldn't succeed at it. So I think that was important as well. And continuing on this, one of the big challenges, as we've said, is that, I've said this too many times, right? People don't take their antiretrovirals. And the challenge with this, by the way, is that the studies are small. The samples are small. The key for us is to let people know that whatever medications people are using, and actually if people are using methamphetamines, if they could tell their doctor that, that would be helpful. Now, if you think that's going to be a little bit crazy, I'll show you on the next page why it might not be. If you're in a harm reduction program, and actually if you're from, I guess if you're from New York, you might have heard of Dr. Sharon Stancliffe, and she actually she gives some advice for best practices. And her feeling about methamphetamines is, one, to use harm reduction. And so there's courses on harm reduction, and I think it's also good around harm reduction to examine your own values about it. So that sometimes people don't like it, but it has worked for many people. Yeah, thanks. Actually, as somebody wrote, I observed that with clients in previous program, there were cognitive impairments observed after long-term use. And do they come back? It's one of those, it depends. Sometimes with good biopsychosocial interventions, actually the good news is people get better when they're not using and they're doing a lot of those health enhancing behaviors, but it takes a while for some people. And again, it's always, when you've worked with somebody who's used for a long time versus a shorter period of time, definitely something to look at. I'm sorry to hear that, actually. There really wasn't much recovery with their level of functioning. You know what else I would think of too is like what other traumatic brain injury was going on, what other illnesses were going on. And I know with rehabilitation, we talk about what's the best a person can do. So for some people, it might be competitive employment. For some people, it might be doing some volunteer work or functioning. So thank you again for writing that in. And I think I just said it's examine your own biases. Yeah, I know that the older 12-step models don't like harm reduction since they believe in abstinence only and think any other approach is enabling. I think you'll have to figure out for yourselves your own feelings about things. So if you're in 12-step recovery, in fact, I've seen this is sometimes challenging. People who are in 12-step recovery who end up working in even like a methadone clinic or a harm reduction program, they have to struggle with their own stuff about that. I will say that there's people who are using and probably doing okay, but we never see them because they don't come into treatment. But I always say too is always look at your own stuff. Does it help people get better or does it hinder them? And our own attitudes can help people or it can get in the way. So that's why I think it's important to kind of look at that. Oh, they are functional. Yeah, it's everybody. It depends. So other things around what Dr. Stancliffe often says, actually, you've seen this in other courses too, around some of the terms that you use, using terms like partner. Remember they used to say, actually, people still use this, where somebody I know went into a cancer hospital in New York, a famous one, and his partner was a patient, and the person who was doing the assessment kept referring to like husband and wife, and it was like, no, I don't think that is. So it's like really looking at what terms to use, like partner, asking people which pronoun they prefer. But again, so using neutral terms and then also kind of looking at your own stuff. So yeah, whatever works. There's a whole variety of things. I think people get better in different ways. And I know I have my own, it's funny, I have my own views of what works, I think, clinically. Sometimes for people in my family are using a different way. I'm a little more judgmental about some things, but I do believe that people are sometimes doing the best that they can, even though it doesn't look like what you want them to do. So I think it's just important to kind of look at that. So this also does come from SAMHSA. I think it was redone in 2015. It's a provider's introduction to substance abuse treatment for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals. You can get this for free, by the way, and this also is really good if you're doing treatment and or you are doing trainings. It's really helpful. Yeah, let's see what people have been writing in. Yeah, you know what? You see that a lot where clients are functional, but they weren't like they were before. Unfortunately, that is true for many people. So people wrote in support groups. Yeah, some people recover in church. That's right. As Alexander writes, everyone has their own path towards recovery. So I know in some of the other courses, we look at what recovery is, and it doesn't say you have to stop using drugs. It just says that you have to look at improvements, almost like physically, psychologically, and socially. And I know that has changed a lot, again, depending on your age and where you live.